Hi, my name is Christina Sacco, and I'm head of marketing at Protus Global. And here I've invited Kirsten Lum, who is the founder and CTO at Storytellers AI. And today she's going to be talking with us a little bit about AI and how it's shaping the marketing landscape. But first, I'd like to introduce you to her background. She's an expert in data science and product and engineering and has used data to tell a story. So, Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So today, AI is such a buzzword and we're hearing so much about it and people are really starting to adopt it. And I thought that we could start off first by explaining the different types of AI to the audience, and then we can, go through our discussion.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think that's one question that a lot of people is on their mind right now of like, what's changed in the landscape of AI that it's become such a big conversation that people are having. And I'll start kind of in the stuff that I consider to be more established and maybe the things that organizations are using most often. And I'll move forward into the things that are more cutting edge and more speculative as to like how they're going to apply to organizations. So the type of AI that is the most common in organizations is something we call predictive analytics or, predictive or supervised learning. Those machine learning models, that's a type of machine learning, is about predicting events and attributes before they happen or before you can gather that information. And that's been around for quite a while. I would say in the early 2010s is where most large companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google and all those companies really started investing in using predictive analytics to help grow their organizations. But what we've seen is that technique, while it's the most proven of the types of AI in terms of having an outcome on organizations, it's also the one that has really not percolated down through to smaller organizations beyond like the Fortune 500. So, yes, Amazon can do it or Google can do it, but like higher education or local government or those kinds of organizations still struggle to use this technique, even though it's proven. So that's predictive analytics, machine learning. There is a second type that we see really often that is pretty difficult to do well, but is so powerful, which we call unsupervised learning. And that's where you're finding patterns in data without necessarily having a specific event or attribute that you're predicting. And we see that used a lot, especially you could think about customer segmentation. Let's take all of my customers, put them in a big bucket and find the patterns so that I understand better how to address the different groups that are within my customer base. And the other thing that we see that used a lot for is to identify what you might do if you knew some event was going to happen ahead of time. Customer churn. Okay, we know this customer is likely to churn. What should I do? What is causing them to churn? And how might I mitigate some of those effects? That's like an unsupervised learning question. And the last one, now I'm moving towards like the most speculative, that's, and this example of we haven't seen it proved out as having a huge driver of growth the way that we've seen these other ones is generative AI. So generative AI is just another type of AI. And that's where you find like the chat GPTs. Those are a type of model that is trained on, in this case, a large number of text documents, and it has learned through that how to generate text in a way that kind of mimics the way that humans do. Or images, same thing with images, huge body of images, and then you can describe that image and it can generate an image that looks kind of like a real image. And that generative AI is kind of the advances in generative AI that came out kind of the end of last year have really sparked this discussion of how can this be used to, grow businesses and grow organizations.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really, really well-worded answer. And this is where I think our discussion can continue when it comes to marketing. So this generative AI specifically is really starting to influence the marketing landscape. So I guess my question is like, how do you see AI impacting marketing creativity in the coming years?
Marketing creativity, I think, will definitely be impacted, especially by generative AI. Because it is so powerful to take off your plate all those tiny things that take so much time, but are very repetitive. So where generative AI, I think that people hope that it is this tool that you can ask it a question, it gives you something, you can just use it directly and it's all good. That's what people hope that it is, but I haven't really seen that play out in practice. It's not going to replace your content writer. You still need someone with a really high expertise in content writing to actually take what is coming out of these generative models and get it ready for a consumer. So what I see that generative AI really helps with is, what are all the repetitive things that a content writer might do that are very well bounded, very specific, and that generative AI actually can do. So a good example of that is like ideating different types of campaign messages that you might do under certain scenarios. I think back to I was a marketer, kind of my first roles were marketing roles. And so I think back into the case where I'm doing like customer engagement. And I've kind of figured out that I have these points in my funnel where I want to be able to talk to people about certain things. And now the hard work is like, okay, I've got my parts of my funnel. What should I say during all of these different points? What's an example of something that might be interesting to say to a consumer during these talk points? And that's where generative AI can be like, okay, here are 100 ideas for things you could say to a consumer if they're likely to churn. Here are some things you could say to them. And then the content writer or the marketer can go through those 100 ideas, and maybe there's 2 or 3 that are great. That still saves so much time for a marketer to have ideas they're culling through. Yeah, exactly. So that's right. Yeah, they're being a really good impact for marketing.
Yeah. And, I thought that was interesting what you said, that it's like a supplement to the marketing role, right? So there's a lot of speculation around generative AI taking the place of people. But from what you're describing and what we've seen so far is that this is really going to be a supplement and a way to make it more efficient without replacing that human touch. So the uniqueness that comes from a person and their creativity is not going to be replaced. It's only going to be enhanced.
Yes. Yeah. With the saying I know that is really now pretty ubiquitous is AI is not going to take your job, but someone using AI might take your job. It's the person, it's like, we call it like having an Iron Man suit, it's still got Tony Stark inside there. But like now you're Iron Man. You can do all these things that you couldn't do if you didn't have this suit on. Yeah.
I love that. That's excellent. That's a good analogy. Sometimes we're just talking about this. How can, companies make sure that AI generated content is aligning with their brand identity and delivering a great customer service, right? So you've got the people who are working it, but how do we make sure that that gets carried across to the end user, the customer?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question for companies to think through very thoughtfully, especially when they're thinking about what AI technologies they use and how it gets incorporated in their workflows. And that's why most of the time I don't recommend having an interface that consumers interact with directly that is an AI. Like even some of the tools that are available, like chatbot type tools and things like that, there's some tools that are popping up where it's trying to replace the little chat icon in the lower right corner of your site or whatever. Mm-hmm. I like to test those because I like to break them. I like to figure out what I can ask those tools and like make it say something it should not say, and it's just too easy right now to do that for even just a relatively sophisticated user to break them in that way, to where I have this very strong, like right now you want there to be a human reviewing any outputs of an AI before it goes to a consumer. So then it's really about, okay, where will we find using AI will give us the scale and not add an extra burden, right? Like you don't want to then all of a sudden put a human in your chat, like interface. So it's things like, can you have systems that are generating content that go to your editor and it's enhancing their ability. It's research tools, it's ideation tools that then go to your team that has the expertise and has the brand knowledge to say this does or does not conform. So that's number one, is having a review in place. And then the number two thing that I recommend when people are using AI tool, well, there's kind of number two is policy, making sure that those folks know your policy for what you can use an AI tool for. You don't put proprietary information into a ChatGPT interface, those kinds of things, having a policy like that in place. And then the last one that I usually recommend is as you're prompting those, that you can actually include some of that detail as you're prompting an AI to say, this is our brand voice, these are our brand guidelines, and you can actually start to get better responses from AI by sharing that information where you can and asking it to actually produce some of your content in your brand voice.
Yeah. So could you give an example of that? Because offline we did speak a little bit about that prompt engineering and how to get the best output.
Yeah. So there is in particular, you see, I really want to find this term. So I'm going to look up the term really quickly. Yes. Okay. All right. So ChatGPT in particular has a feature called custom instructions. And that I think is only available right now for if you're paying for a ChatGPT, it's like ChatGPT Pro. But if you go in there, there is a form you can fill out that says, every time you answer me, make sure that you're following these instructions with every response. And so if you've experienced using ChatGPT to do things before, it'll like forget some of the instructions as you go through the conversation. Yeah. But custom instructions is a way to make sure like every time you respond to me, just like remember that this is what I want. And I find that's a very powerful tool. If you're using ChatGPT to do any kind of content creation, putting some of your brand guidelines and your guidelines for how it should respond into custom instructions improves the output a lot. And most like generative AI tools have some concept of this. If they don't, then that really goes down into your prompt engineering. How are you structuring your query to the AI to constrain the way that it's able to respond to you, which interestingly, I find more often than not improves its quality. Even though you're saying, constraining how it's responding, you're constraining to a higher quality response rather than the sort of general average response that it's trained to do.
Right. No, that's a great point because, as a marketer and here at Protus Global, we do use that for ideation. We use it for some content generation. And you do have to make sure that when you're prompting it, that you're saying, okay, this is what I'd like the brand voice to be, and you give the requirements, like if it's a certain length or if you want it to be from a certain perspective. And I think that people who are just learning how to use it or just digging in, though, that's great feedback because as we start to see this be used more and more by consumers and just the average layman, I know people who are using it to write letters, for instance. Like they're like, this is way better. Here's my idea. Can you write this? Or, for instance, candidates can be using this for their resume or for their cover letters. So there's so many opportunities for just people to use it. I think that's actually going to start affecting how people are expecting to see marketing, right? So it kind of leads into what we discussed, how people are starting to get familiar with AI-generated content. So that might be shifting their expectations out of what's coming out of marketing. So how do you think marketers should respond?
Right. I think there is a framework for how to think about the usage of AI in a consumer-facing way that I've been sort of noodling on for a couple months as I've given some advice on, where should we be using AI? And I kind of look at this framework. It's got two axes. One axis is how human should it be, or how much are you leaning into the AI like vibe, which I can talk about AI vibes a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then where along the spectrum of like how much are you relying on AI as you're generating some of this stuff? So is it like really in the background, it's like light, it's in ideation, or is it like the final product that's going to the consumer is fully generated by AI? And so I think about, human versus AI vibes, and then like light versus heavy usage. And when I talk to folks that are using this and thinking about consumer expectations, there's sort of a danger zone, which is the thing that I'm seeing folks get really upset about is things that look human and are presented as human, but are actually very heavily using AI. And that's where being really upfront with consumers about the usage of AI is really important. And I'll give some examples of like, where, and especially in marketing, where I've seen these different configurations. So starting with that danger zone, that's like AI influencers, which a lot of like folks have seen. Like there's like, companies that have like a persona that is these images are generated fully by AI. It's not a real person. It's like AI generated images, but they're really upfront with saying like, this is an AI. I think that people are nervous about that because it looks so human. That's like, you could fool me. If you hadn't told me this is AI, I would think it was a human. It was a real person. And I think consumers are a little nervous about that it's creating this like attack vector for them of being tricked. You think about like spam companies that use this text to speech technology to like fool our parents into like giving away, or our grandparents into giving away their like personal information. Like there's this whole way of scale of like tricking people into it in a scalable way that I think people are nervous about. So I think the companies that use AI influencers that are upfront about it, it's like this danger zone, but people are also really interested in it. So it's like this tread at your own risk here. Like, is your customer going to think this is cool, or is your customer going to think this is creepy? And knowing your customer well is important there. But aside from really heavily using AI, so like AI generated images and stuff, there are a lot of ways to use AI that I think consumers are going to lean more on the side of like, this is cool. And I've seen that with my favorite example of that was Salesforce, their Matthew McConaughey commercial. It's called, what was the name of it? Let me look at that really quick. Oh, yes. Okay. So Salesforce did this ad series called Ask More of AI. And they had Matthew McConaughey walking through these scenes. There was like one in a forest. There was one in this like Western town. And everything around him was like, looked AI generated. I actually don't know the extent to which they actually used AI to do it, or whether they were using other techniques to just make it look like AI. But, things were sort of that like flickery, like, moving between styles, like what you see in those AI generated videos. They used that as a background to like give the attention and the interest for him to say like, if this is what AI can do now, what should we expect? Like, what should we expect it to be able to do for us? And I think that was a really good use of capturing the interest in AI while giving it to the consumer in a way that they can say, this is cool. This is a artistic technique. It's not something that's trying to trick me. So that was Salesforce's example. And then my other example that I think was interesting is right when ChatGPT came out, and actually it was Midjourney. I think it was when Midjourney became really popular. Coca-Cola did an ad called Masterpiece that was like someone sitting in an art museum and they were like, bored. And then the paintings like conspire to get him a Coca-Cola so that he can like, be refreshed or whatever. And what was funny is they did a behind the scenes. They really said, this is the first AI enabled ad. And then they did it behind the scenes and I looked at it and it was like very minimal use of AI. Like they actually had a look, it had that same like flickery, like almost rotoscope style of imagery. But if you look at how they used AI, it was like, you wouldn't have been able to tell, I don't think, where they had used AI. So it really is like capturing this interest in AI, but using pretty lightweight techniques to do it. So yeah, I think that there is some opportunity to lean into the style while being upfront about it that can capture interest and kind of give this like modern feel, but not make the consumer feel like, oh, this company is going to trick me at some point. They have the technology to trick me, which is, I think, what people are worried about.
Yeah, I think you hit on so many great points here, right? So firstly, we'll make sure that those links are provided in the description so people can take a look at what you're describing. But I think at the end of the day, no matter what, your brand should always be upfront and transparent with the customer. And I think that's just like branding 101. That's marketing 101. As long as you're being upfront and transparent about who you are and what you're doing, I think to your point, the interest in AI, right, is going to pique people's interest. But then because it's unknown, there's some fear. So there's like a halfway point on that axis that you're talking about where You can play with the idea. We saw that happen a lot when digital graphics came out, right? So for the longest time, it was photography or like even people drawing, back in Mad Men days. And then the ads started to become more graphic, and you saw these like really highly digitalized and like stylized, ad campaigns go out the door because people were fascinated with this new technology. So now we have AI, and as a marketer, we could sit and really lean into this, and there's some curiosity, there's some interest, and I think people are fascinated with, Matthew McConaughey, and, are those people behind him in the commercial generated, or are they real, right? Like that, and it's kind of fun and exciting, and, it makes people want to learn more and engage more with the brand without being fearful of it.
Yeah.
So to your point, like being upfront about it, I think that those are really, really great points. And I think you and I discussed like that creative sweet spot, right? So how can AI enhance the creativity and marketing rather than replace the human creativity? Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I would. I would love to. It like makes me pause because I think that's one of the things that people struggle with a lot when they're thinking a bit about AI. And in fact, one of the conversations that I think has really captured people with AI in general is like, is it conscious? Is it not conscious? Is it a person? Like, is it a person? Is it technology? Is it math? Right. And I think that it's really made us, there are actually these tests of artificial intelligence that ChatGPT that have never been passed before that ChatGPT now passes. Like there are things like the Turing test that people were like, seemed like such a far shore to build technology that would pass the Turing test. And then overnight, all of a sudden now it's passing. And you think, well, does that really mean what we thought it meant? Or now people are starting to move. What is that benchmark for considering something conscious or like human? And so it's made it, I think the reason why I pause is like the question you're asking is like got this practical side, and it's also got this like existential side. People are like, right. What is human creativity? What's the part of human creativity that's now defensible against AI? And
yes,
I don't know that I have like a really, how should I put it? Like even the answers that I feel like I have come up with over the last few months, some of them don't feel fully satisfying. And I think we're going to find out more about them as time goes on and we see the edges, the plateaus of ability. But one of the things that I see AI not being able to do very well at all is maintain a thread over time. And that really gets to, in terms of marketing, the idea of brand. Like, I don't think that AI is going to be able to replace our ability to create a coherent brand from first principles. You talk about the principles of your brand, like this is our voice, this is our, those kinds of things. It can help like ideate in those spaces, but like to create one, it doesn't have the same feel as like a human who's created the brand. And then two, maintaining that consistency such that each time, even if you're using AI tools, that what's coming out of those tools feels right to that brand. It's right. As a scientist, I'm like, this is where it starts to get into like the art of like, you can feel the vibe. Like there is a vibe of AI generated content that feels very cold and canned, that I haven't seen it be able to break. And a human coming in and making sure that has the feeling that someone is actually taking care of you as a consumer, like I think that that's going to be important for a long time. I don't see that going away, for a very, very long time.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of people's fears, right? So creatives in the field in marketing, you're an artist as a graphic artist, can AI help you? Absolutely. But is it going to really replace your creative thought? Or, I had an artist once say, they stop when it feels yummy. How do you stop and it feels yummy. You can't describe that feeling. It's intuition. It's a gut feeling, right? So you can't say this is when it's hit its sweet spot. Only a person can really determine where that sits. And that's where the humanity comes into play. And, AI is just not there. It probably won't be there, maybe never be there. I mean, you can't replicate the human condition, right? Like we felt that on Zoom for so many years, through the pandemic. So, and I think you brought up another interesting point. There's some ethical and regulatory implications when it comes to the use of AI. And we actually wrote a AI blog not too long ago about how HR can implement these types of parameters when they're using this so that we don't build in biases into the hiring process or even on the marketing side. So I don't know if you have some insights on that, but I know that the regulations, it's very much like when the internet started, right? So the internet was a wild, wild west and everybody was just putting stuff out there and it's learning and growing. AI is in that stage right now. So what's your best advice to brands and marketers today to help build in these regulatory and, ethical best practices as they're using the tools?
Yeah, I love the analogy to the way that internet and email and all of that was kind of the same sort of question, in the last couple decades, and that we're in another phase of that where we've got to figure it out. There's no pre-templated today rules, and there's open questions that have yet to be decided. I think in particular around things like copyright. Who owns the copyright of the output of an AI? And at what point have you made enough edits to an AI image to make it now something that is originally yours? And I think that that's for me, one of the big open questions that I'm watching is where regulators are going to fall on that question. Who owns the copyright to the output of models? And then the question, even fundamentally, were these models trained in a way that respects the copyright of the assets that are underneath that model? I think is fundamental to that too. Because if they weren't trained, then you can't use any of those outputs, right? Like there's, that could be one of the outcomes of this, is that ends up happening. So I think that's why, personally, I exercise caution in using raw outputs from an AI because those questions are undecided, and building a lot of processes around AI when maybe, in a few months or a few years, the Supreme Court's going to come down and be like, this violates copyright. It's just not worth it, right? And then two, I think that the other thing that I really recommend organizations putting some thought into is that policy question, particularly what AI tools can we use and what information can we share with an AI system. And it's very similar, actually, I think, to, the analogy would be Google search. Like you wouldn't put sensitive company information into a Google search for the same reason you wouldn't put sensitive company information into, ChatGPT. And what I have started to see folks do is really think about being proactive about, okay, here are the tools you can use. Like it's coming. AI tools are so powerful for things like software engineering, for content generation workflows, for ideation, for, summarization. So this is a very powerful tool. Again, it's your Iron Man suit. Yeah. But because of that, because your employees are going to be like, okay, I need to go get my Iron Man suit, you should ahead of time say, this is where we source those. We only use this tool. We don't use these other tools. And then two, here's the information that we share in those tools. And this is the information we don't. And that way, your employees know, and being proactive about explaining that, I think is super important.
Yeah. And I just, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. I think I just want to land on this one last thing. So you talked about this axis, right? Can you just explain more? Because we're going to have this graphic that we're going to share. Explain more about this axis and where people would sit and what it means.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So what's funny is that there actually is a part of this axis that's been around forever that we haven't even really, we just take for granted now, which is like, it looks human and it's sort of like light touch in the background. It's like Photoshop content aware fill is actually AI, you know, or your product recommendations on your website, that's AI. Like there are these things, it's just like a little piece in your whole machinery, tiny little cog in your whole machinery, but it does something in a way that would be pretty unscalable for a human to do. Those tools are all over the place. And I think consumers, there was a period of time where you think about like Photoshop as being really controversial, especially in like, you know, human photography and like touching up human photos. And like that was a big deal where people were like, you're lying to us and it's detrimental for us to see these images. And so, you know, even having some places with regulations around how much you can touch up an image or in what ways you can touch up an image, I think is a really good analogy for what we might see in the AI space. Like all those same guardrails sort of apply, that you shouldn't be lying to people. You shouldn't be misrepresenting your product or, you know, creating unrealistic standards. And I think that's where that really sits, is where it's meant to look human and it's sort of like hidden in the background. But even still, it should be like, this shouldn't be misrepresentation. It should just be a tool that helps you to get the end state, a positive end state, a little bit faster. Like content aware, you know, remove the what is it, the power lines in the background or whatever. You know, that seems
yeah, a little cleanup, make it a little bit easier. You know, post production. Well, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening, and you know, just for our audience, you know, Kirsten is also a lecturer at the University of Washington, and we'll have relevant links in the description below to everything that we've discussed, as well as the graphic that we were discussing. But I just really enjoyed this conversation. I think as we start to continue down this path with AI generating tools, especially in marketing, having these ethical implications in place, having this human aspect, you know, that we have to keep in mind, and also just how we can use it to make our lives more efficient and help us market and personalize our brands as best we can to our end consumer is, you know, it's exciting. And thank you so much for all your insights.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christina Sacco, head of marketing at Protus Global, and we'll see you next time.